What's the biggest secret it could be burying away in my field? I thought, I'm just going to check this out. I get a call from this guy, and let me tell you, he sounded scared. That's the moment in a thriller when you kind of go, well, I wasn't interested, but now I am. This has got my attention. What physicists found is that there are this jiggling energy as particles flash in and out of existence around what's called the 0 point baseline. These things are flashing up onto the screen of our perception all the time. What we see out there is a sort of bizarre reflection of our own consciousness. My wife was holding her mum's hand and she said, well, I was in this place that was infinite and timeless. Everything was connected. And it was imbued by this thing that I can only describe as love, something called a shared death experience. One of the pioneers of the CIA's remote viewing program, the psychic spying program, he said that his psychic gifts were not unique to him. We all have them. We live in a simulated world that is imbued with something ineffable that is the essence of whoever or whatever created it. Non-human intelligence we can handle. Where it gets sticky is when I was 5, my parents split. And my sister and I, she was 2.5 years younger than me, we went to live with my grandparents. My grandparents lived in a very large, rambling house in the English countryside. So you guess, and everyone can probably imagine it. And so picture these 2 small children, 5 in my case, 2.5 in my sister's case. And my grandparents were lovely, but they were quite remote. You know, they were sort of old school English types. Actually, not entirely true, because my grandmother was American, but she'd married my English grandfather and came to live there. So we lived there with them for about 3 years before I went to live back with my father again. And about halfway through that time, my grandmother died. And she was very interested. I didn't know any of this stuff till later, but she was very interested in the occult and the paranormal. She was lovely, but she had a terrifying fear of being buried in her coffin. In other words, being buried alive. Again, I didn't know any of this till later in life. And years earlier, she had, it's a bit macabre, this story, which is why I don't often trot it out first thing. But she had made my father promise years earlier that when she died, that he would get a doctor to make incisions in her wrists so that she would not wake up in her coffin. And she had read a story called, it was by Edgar Allan Poe, about that happening to the protagonist. So it was very vivid in her mind. But anyway, my dad, being my dad, just forgot about it. He didn't know whether his mother was being serious, and anyway, he forgot about it. So cut to the night she died, and she died unexpectedly during a routine operation in London. And my father came back to this large rambling house where my sister and I were. And after spending some time talking to my grandfather, he went to bed. He's been very clear, had been very clear in telling us that he'd not had a drink because he was recovering from hepatitis. So he was perfectly lucid. He lay down in his bed, rolled over, tried to go to sleep, and suddenly he felt what he knew to be my grandmother's hand pressing itself under the bed covers into his hand. And at that moment, obviously, he sat with it for a bit, but then he sat bolt upright in bed, pressed the light on, the hand disappeared, obviously, and he suddenly remembered the promise that he'd made her. That was the point. And anyway, he sort of, being a rationalist, which he was, my dad, he then turned the light off, said, it's grief, I'm imagining it, switched the light off, went back to sleep, or tried to go back to sleep. And in that moment, he started hearing footsteps in the attic above him. Now, my grandmother had had a particular habit in life. She was an insomniac. And she would go up into the attic and tidy it. She would sweep it up with a broom And you could hear her doing this. Even I remember doing this, hearing her as a kid. You could hear the clack, clack, clack of the broom as it hit the sideboards in the attic. And he heard all of this going on upstairs. And then he started to hear her coming downstairs towards his room. And my dad wasn't particularly religious, but he started praying and saying, look, forgive me, but I don't want to see my mum. I don't want to see her. Please stop it, go away. And just as they reached his door, the footsteps stopped. Now, I don't remember any of that, of course. I was 6.5. But that story, which was told to me, did influence. I mean, it did have an influence on me, clearly. But a bit like my dad, I was a real hard-boiled materialist rationalist. And so I literally sort of dismissed it as, it's just a good ghost story, And then, as perhaps we'll get into, I sort of became involved in the whole consciousness thing professionally. So about 5 years ago, a chap called Robert Bigelow, who's based in Las Vegas, he's a billionaire, but he's always had a profound interest in the paranormal, both in UFOs and in consciousness. He launched an essay competition, and the contest, the name of the exam question in the contest was provide the best proof for the survival. Provide the best proof for the survival of consciousness post-death, after death. Now, it happened, and perhaps we can get on to how this happened. I'd done a lot of research into that prior to this essay competition. So I entered the contest, and of course, I argued it in a very sort of, if you'll forgive the word, rational way. But in my memory, in my mind, was this incident with my grandmother. So somewhere in me, there was this subconscious sort of buried knowledge that this was real. This wasn't something that was abstract for me. This, or data driven. I had background. I had skin in the game, if you like. But and so I wrote the essay, and to my enormous surprise, I won a prize for it. Not the top prize, but I won. There were 29 of us who won it. It was a $1.5 million competition, and so I went to Las Vegas, where Mr. Bigelow lives and works, got the prize, and that set me on a different road into the sort of the whole consciousness arena. But before that, that was a very recent thing in my work life. I started out, as we may get on to, Amrit, as a hard-boiled investigative reporter, as an aerospace and defense journalist.
I wanted to ask about that because, I mean, I don't want to suggest you've been around this long, but in 1956,
you'd be surprised.
a group of top aerospace engineers, and my background structural engineering, so, dates and numbers matter to me. They predicted that humans would master gravity control by the end of that decade. And this is 1956. But that breakthrough, when I was looking at your work, never went public. And decades later, you actually had a chance encounter with one of these engineers, which actually seemed to have sucked you into a bit of an anti-gravity quest. Can you take us back to that moment and what convinced you? I mean, you were, as you were alluding to just then, a respected Defense Weekly journalist. Why would you at that point take anti-gravity, of all things, seriously when most would have dismissed it as science fiction?
Sure. So I'll take you back a few years. So what you're describing is the book I wrote called The Hunt for Zero Point, which came out in 2001. And it was about that. It was about anti-gravity.
An incredible cult following as well. It's an incredible read for anyone that hasn't. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So I wrote that book, and it came out in 2001. for about 15 years before that, I'd been a aerospace and defense journalist, something I'd always been interested in. And I was working for a magazine called Jane's Defense Weekly. It was the sort of premier trade magazine in its field. And I'd been working there, I guess, maybe for about 3 or 4 years. I loved that job. I mean, took me all over the world, and it was in a sphere that I completely loved. So it was my dream job. But about 3 or 4 years in, I thought, I'm pretty lucky here. I'm pretty privileged. I've got access to just about any defense individual organization on the planet, barring the Russians. That was for much of that time. They were locked away behind the Iron Curtain because it's during the Cold War. But anywhere in America, anywhere in Europe, rest of the world, I could get to these people because of the magazine's reputation. So I thought, I need to make more of this. So I sort of posed myself this question, which was, what do you think the biggest secret could be out there that, say, the Pentagon or my own country or others, but basically America, because America was where the tech is. What's the biggest secret it could be burying away in my field? And I thought, well, probably it would be a propulsion breakthrough. It would be, we've had combustion engines, jet engines for decades. It's about time we had a propulsion breakthrough, but there's no evidence of that. But maybe I should just keep my eyes and my ears open as I'm going around my regular job, which I did. So I'd go to all of these places, and some of them were extraordinarily legendary. I mean, there are places like the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, which had built these fantastic breakthrough aircraft like the U-2 spy plane and the Blackbird. And I just started asking questions. And after a while, I was building up this picture. I should preface this with one other thing, which was around the time I posed that question to myself, an article landed on my desk which referenced exactly what you said, which was, it came from a mid-1950s magazine, and it was labeled "The G Engines Are Coming." And in the article, it said that a number of these well-known aerospace companies were investigating gravity and how to beat gravity. And it said, to your point, Amrit, that within about a decade, maybe less, this breakthrough would be achieved because they were all working on it. And even though I'd asked myself that question, and we could debate long and hard about, so that article landed on my desk around the time that I was posing myself that question, which is rather extraordinary. But I was still, this rational left side of my brain was kicking in, and I'm going, come on. I mean, all right. So all of these companies are talking about breakthroughs in gravity and anti-gravity. Well, if that had happened, surely we'd have seen it by now. I mean, this was in the mid-50s. The breakthrough would occur in the mid-60s. This was now the early 90s. So where was the breakthrough? Now, I'd done enough work as an investigative reporter in that field to know that secrets hold. I knew that. I'd covered things like the stealth program beforehand. I'd been out to the Nevada desert at Area 51. I knew that people say you can't keep stuff secret for 35 years. And I'm going, oh, yes, you can. I knew that firsthand. So my mind was open to the idea that secrets do hold, but I was still resisting this concept, this notion in this magazine article. But because there were some famous company names in there, Convair, I think, Boeing, Lockheed, some well-known aerospace names, I thought, I'm just going to check this out. I'll place 1 or 2 check calls with people I know in the business and see if there's anything in it. and then I'm going to leave it alone and I'm going to go back to my day job. So there's a guy who's mentioned in the article who's called George S. Trimble, and he works for a company called Martin. And obviously he would have been, this was all happening in the 50s, as I said, so this guy would have been long since retired. But he was quoted amongst many other people as saying, yep, we're on the threshold of this breakthrough, it's going to happen, yeah, it just takes a bit of time and money. So I call this contact in the business, in the aerospace business, I've known him a long time, and I said, please could you trace this guy if he's still alive, and because I'd like to do an interview with him, just ask him about this. And I forget about it, maybe a week or two passes by, and then I get a call from this guy, and he says, Nick, I don't know what you're working on, but I've spoke to George Trimble, and he doesn't want to speak to you, he doesn't want to speak to me again, and let me tell you, he sounded scared. Well, that's the moment in a thriller when you kind of go, well, I wasn't interested then until now, but now I am. This has got my attention and I'm in.
Especially as a journalist, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a complete no-brainer. That then sets me off on the hunt for 0 Point in the title. And I go to all of these weird, exotic, wonderful, creepy, exciting places in America and elsewhere. And I pursue this question single-handedly, single-mindedly, which is, did we beat gravity? And I'm not going to spoil the ending by telling you what happens, but it's kind of, I'm a novelist as well. I was a novelist before I did any of this. So it is built like a thriller. It's totally non-fiction. It all happened, but it's built like a thriller. So that's why I'm not going to tell you the ending.
Inspired souls, human beings, I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you that are subscribed to this podcast, because everything you see around here is a total co-creation. It's powered and empowered by your subscription to this channel. Guests like Nick are here because of your love, your support. Thank you so much for everything you do. To all of you that haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment. And actually, many of you think you are subscribed, but you're not. So if you can see the subscribe button below and it's lighting up, it means you haven't subscribed. Please do hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon, and join the community and movement, spreading love, positivity, wisdom, and insights like this around the planet together. At the time of this recording, 20% of you that regularly watch this channel are subscribed. The rest, 4/5 of you, actually aren't. So please do us a solid, join the community, hit subscribe. Thank you so much. And while we're talking about community, just remember that there is actually a community aspect to the podcast as well. If you want to join us, inspiredevolution.com/circle. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Join us once a month. You meet guests like Nick. You get to ask your questions directly of them. I step completely out of the way and you get to ask all of your questions. We gather weekly for meditations, group sharings, lots of cool stuff happening on the inside of the circle as well. Link in the description below. Back to Nick in today's episode. Well, it's interesting as well, because at this point, it would have been considered career suicide by many in your field to be so doggedly, to your words, pursuing. I mean, do you reflect upon what inner motivation or vision kept you through 10 years of such deep investigation?
That's a really good question. And because I keep saying in the book, as anyone who reads it knows, I'm cross-questioning myself all the time, which is, why are you doing this? This is insanity. And particularly when I was researching it 20 plus years ago, almost 30 years ago, this was nothing that you would bring up in polite company in the aerospace and defense industry. I can assure you, they would look at you. This is why I had to keep my inquiry very to myself. And that's why it took so long as well, because you couldn't just blunder into Lockheed Martin or Boeing and go, hey guys, tell me about your anti-gravity program. They would send for the men in white coats. So I did it very slowly, very subtly, and mostly I was on receive mode. I was just watching and listening. And certainly when the book came out, I mean, my colleagues journalistic colleagues, I mean, looked at me askance. I mean, they probably thought, I think many of them did, that I'd, drunk far too much Kool-Aid and had really wandered off the reservation. And, but to your question, there was something about it that I could not stop. It was, once the idea had formed in my mind, there was no way I could unsee it, unhear it, or stop it. And it just propelled me forwards. I certainly didn't set out to write a book. That wasn't the intention. The intention was to satisfy my curiosity. My curiosity had been fired by what I'd read in that article and this guy's refusal to talk to me. And the deeper I got into it, of course, I realized that there was something in it, and that this was not a fanciful question at all, that this question had been pursued by these companies, and to a degree was being pursued quite visibly in places like NASA as I was doing the research. But it was such a taboo subject that even they were suppressing what they were doing for fear that if it got out, it would be ridiculed. They would be ridiculed. I mean, I remember after the book came out, we did a story in Jane's. I had a very supportive editor, and he knew I'd been writing the book. And when the book came out, he said, "Have you got any additional research that has happened since the book came out?" And I said, "Yeah, well, actually, I have." I said, "Somebody mailed me anonymously a Boeing presentation talking about how they had an active research program to investigate something called gravity shielding, which is a mechanism for, as it suggests, shielding gravity to reduce the weight of anything suspended in a column above this gravity shielding device, which is science heresy. I mean, that is impossible per modern Newtonian physics. But yet these people, these organizations, very small scale, were producing interesting results. So I said, "Yeah, I've got this paper, and it details in great detail what Boeing is up to, how much money it's spent on it, who it's doing the experiment with blah, 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 blah." He said, "Great." He said, "Let's go for it." So we put a picture on the cover of the Boeing logo, and then we had an apple on the cover with the apple going up, not falling. And the headline was something like, "Boeing beats gravity," or "Boeing tackles gravity." I can't remember what it was. You couldn't believe the shit that came down on me from the Boeing company, and on the magazine, and just in general about that story. And which, again, that was, 20 years ago now. But that, with the benefit of hindsight for me, bespeaks something interesting, which is, why react so viscerally?
You've touched a vein.
If there was nothing there at all. Well, actually, I already knew there was something there because I said I had this paper. And about, maybe it was a year or two later, I ran into the project manager whose research program we'd written about in the magazine. And I think I ran into him in a bar in Seattle, which is where Boeing is. And he said to me, "Thanks a bunch." He said, "Thanks to your story, my research program got killed." So, but actually then he was quite nice about it. I just said, "Look, I'm only doing my job. That's I'm supposed to report on stuff, and this was an interesting project that you were working on." And then we had a beer and we made up, and it was all fine. But that is just a little vignette that gives you a sense of how taboo this subject was back then. It's become less so now because there's all of this, recent interest in UFOs and stuff. But it was real heresy then, dangerous stuff.
Well, it's interesting because I want to find out about a couple of moments because yes, to your point, the book's written as a thriller. I mean, it's yeah. How do I say this without overly flattering you in the same moment? But it's written really incredibly well, and I mean, the journey takes you through, a trail from Nazi Germany, Bell anti-gravity experiments. You end up in, Cold War black projects, Project Silverbug and others, all the way to potential modern rumors of secret gravity control programs. I wanted to ask you, were there a couple of defining moments for you where you felt like this was really astonishing? Was it the caliber of the companies that you're interfacing with, that this was no nonsense? Or like, what was it that actually made you feel this might actually be real? What?
Well, again, it's a great question. And I think probably with a disappointing answer in that, I'm very data driven. I'm a nerd when it comes to facts and data, and my training had been, bear in mind, I wasn't writing even for a newspaper. I was writing for a specialist trade magazine where sort of if you put a foot wrong on the facts, you'd get, aerospace and defense companies breathing down your neck going, you're wrong. That's just, that's factually wrong. And I worked with some old sort of doyens of the business who were fabulous mentors, but who were strict and go stick to the facts. You've got to be very factually driven. So I all of that was steeped in me when I did all of this. So it was more like this steady drip, drip, drip of fact-based evidence. And I'm just trying to think now whether there was a sort of aha moment or a real sort of epiphany. And no, I mean, there weren't. It was, there were moments, and there are moments in the book, that I relate that are turning points. And, one of them, for example, was I made a documentary back in the late 90s called $1 Billion Secret, which explored the hinterland between UFO sightings and secret aircraft projects, because back then I thought this is another slam dunk for you, Nick. Here, you can solve this, no problem. It's all just secret aircraft programs, and so I in the course of that documentary, I filmed this wonderful guy, a sort of old scientist at Lockheed Martin called Boyd Bushman, and Boyd, in the middle of this interview, starts talking about anti-gravity. And we're sitting in Lockheed Martin's facilities in Fort Worth, Texas. And there are minders in the room and, everything. And he's talking about anti-gravity and the fact that he's doing these experiments at Fort Worth. And I remember thinking, God, I've been maybe on this trail for several years, certainly. But I'd never really had anyone in the business go, which he did say to me, keep going, you're on the right track. And so that was a moment. But for the most part, it was just drip, drip, drip. And, until I had a picture. And actually that's something, again, that I think it's really important. It's especially important today with so much conflicting data around, there's fake news, and it's really important to me that you formulate a 360-degree picture of whatever it is you're looking at. Never rely on a single source, because that single source could be unreliable. Instead, build your picture up with this 360-degree view, if you can, of what you're talking about.
Well, let's dive in a little bit deeper in terms of what we're talking about, because zero-point energy, your research delved into zero-point energy. The idea kind of being that we're drawing, I guess, limitless energy from the vacuum of space as a way to, almost like a key to defy gravity itself. And as you just alluded to, intriguingly, you ended up exploring whether UFO sightings like Roswell might have been, I guess, experimental anti-gravity crafts that and I mean, in your view, what's the relationship between these advanced technologies and the UFO phenomenon? Are we dealing with human innovation? Is it something extraterrestrial, or is it a bit of both? Like, I'd like to get my bearings here with you.
So we're now sort of scooting forwards many decades or several decades in my mind. So so back when I was writing The Hunt for Zero Point, that was a very focused search on that, that aspect of have we beaten gravity? Have we cracked the gravity code? And the 0 point reference in the title, as you say, Amrit, is about 0 point energy, which for those who don't know it is about it is a phenomenon in which virtual subatomic particles pop into existence around what's called as the 0 point baseline of existence, which is a vacuum chilled to absolute zero, and there shouldn't be subatomic movement classically at that level, the 0 point level. But what physicists found is that there are this jiggling energy as particles flash in and out of existence, which is why they're called virtual particles. There is a phenomenal infinite amount of potential energy in those flashes of in and out of existence of these particles. But of course, because they're virtual, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to tap into that energy. So, but many people have tried, and as I went on that journey, I found that even very credentialed physicists today had spent their careers, their professional lives, trying to make that happen. There are anecdotal stories that people have cracked the 0 point field and have pulled energy from it, and I do tend to believe some of them are true. The problem is it's very difficult to batten that down with facts, because the facts are pretty elusive. And we might go into why that is in a while. So then to that other question about what are UFOs? Well, I think they're a mix of a lot of things. I think that there is some man-made technology in there. I think that there is some non-human intelligence technology in there as well. And I also think that reality itself is much stranger than classical physics gives it credit. And that some of what we see out there is a sort of bizarre reflection of our own consciousness. So it's almost like it's a mirror. And that is why UFOs, or partly why many UFOs are so strange. They don't, one thing that baffles me as an aerospace guy is, why don't we just see the same shape all the time? Or maybe a handful of UFO shapes. But instead, it's like there's an infinite number of them. And one of the things that I had to get my head around very early on was, given that sort of plethora of variation, and given the plethora of sightings, I mean, probably, I've never totted it up, but there probably are dozens of sightings every day around the world of craft. Can all of these craft and their occupants, if they have any, be making it here from some distant point of the galaxy or different galaxies, exploring our planet? I fail to believe that our planet, for all its beauty, can be that interesting, that beings are coming here the entire time, every day, for decades, to case us out. So with that in mind, I'm thinking, well, maybe it's something else, or maybe it's partly something else, or maybe it's mostly something else, which then caused me to take a look at the nature, the construct of reality itself. Because if it's not beings coming here, journeying here in interstellar spacecraft every day of the week, then surely it's something to do with the way that we perceive reality. Because these things are flashing up onto the, if we can call it that, the screen of our perception all the time. And I've got my Substack site is called Rogue Icons, and I call it that because there is a fantastic cognitive scientist who works out of the University of California called Professor Donald Hoffman. I don't know if you've come across his work, but the guy's a genius in my mind, because
Absolutely
what he came
phenomenal.
up with was a metaphor for how we perceive reality, how we deal with reality. And he likens that to a computer screen with icons on it. And just as I am, clicking on icons on my computer screen, that gives me a way of navigating around my computer. I don't need to understand about bits and bytes and the machinery and the software that goes into those icons. I just click on the icon. That's good enough. But of course, in amongst all those regular icons of experience that we click on to live our lives, there are non-ordinary icons, ghosts, cryptid creatures, UFOs, near-death experiences. Those are non-ordinary icons, which I call rogue icons. But they're not just unique to me. Lots of people see them. So they must come from somewhere. And we're just, to my mind, having investigated this stuff, we're just not seeing every day all the icons on the screen. We just see a lot of icons. But every now and again, there's some glitch in the field, the matrix, whatever you want to call it. And those rogue icons pop up on my screen of experience, my perception screen. And I see them, I hear them, I smell them, whatever, they're there. And those need to be investigated by science. They're not, because science is terrified of reputational risk and doesn't go there. But to my mind, that's where breakthroughs come. Einstein gets his breakthrough about general relativity when he sees Mercury in a position behind the sun that it shouldn't be in, because gravity is lensing the view between here and there, and this gives him his insight into general relativity and the space-time construct that is our dominating now, science worldview. But we need a new science worldview, because the existing one is breaking apart before our eyes with all of these rogue icons appearing in our experience, for millions of people all over the world. And that, to me, bespeaks the fact that we are on the threshold of some new science paradigm that we haven't quantified yet.
Hey there, Inspired Souls. Spirituality is not something we just talk about here at the Inspired Evolution. It's something we live and breathe with our entire beings. Whether it's in your career, your life, the way you lead in the world, or your relationships, it's at the heart of the way we believe life should be lived. And so if you're feeling out of alignment, or you can feel that there's something more, or you're feeling like you're not thriving in life, touch wood, the way that you ought to be, then we've got guidance to take you even deeper. You've got support from me one-on-one, and you've also got a like-minded, like-hearted community masterminding, master-hearting together through guidance together. And you don't have to take my word for it. This is how people all over the world have transformed through guidance.
Everything just kind of fell into place, and now I'm on a path that I actually believe in and I'm excited about, because I feel like I'm becoming my best self.
Over those 2 years, I have done so much. I can't believe where I am now. I'm thrilled where I am now. Not only was he a coach, but he became a divine presence in my life.
You can show up to Amrit with all sorts of chaos in your life, and you leave feeling completely centered with some direction that is going to get you results. It's just magic when you're in coaching with Amrit. You just flow with it all.
I feel that I have access and connection to somebody who is deeply entrenched in my development.
If you're thinking about it, just do it. You won't regret it.
So what are you waiting for? If you feel the call, then join me on a call. amritsandhu.com/call. Link on screen now and also at the top of the description in the show notes below. Join me in a call. Let's dive in deep to your path, onwards, upwards, and inwards from here. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a call. Go on, I'll see you there. I do want to discuss that threshold, but before I jump there, because it does seem like there is science and we've referred to it sometimes as scientism on the podcast, like the reputation that, sort of the existing pedagogy of science has. Part of me was wondering, today, why such world-altering technologies would be suppressed. You've mentioned science, but is some of it military? Is some of it economic? Is some of it cultural? Is some of it even spiritual? Why is such information suppressed? These rogue icons, why do you think they're suppressed?
For many reasons. But let's start with the military. So again, I've covered military programs. I've covered classified programs like stealth. And I've seen how, stealth was a big breakthrough. That was from an engineering and a scientific standpoint, that was a huge breakthrough. It was probably the biggest military breakthrough since the atomic bomb, when it began to be sort of properly explored in the 1970s and then fielded in the 1980s. And it was fielded in secret. So the first stealth fighter squadron, I think, went operational in 1983, but it wasn't revealed until 1988. And these things have been flying around the desert southwest of America for a long time before the Reagan administration said, this plane is real. So there's the military secrecy aspect of a breakthrough like anti-gravity, which would be huge. It would confer such a military advantage to the power that had it first, that this is something that would be sought after. And it was something that would be extremely suppressed and buried through all manner of means, not just through rigorous, secrecy, shields and walls and such around, physical walls around a program to stop it leaking out, or people, spies getting into it. But there are other means, there are literally disinformation and ridicule. Those are very powerful weapons, which have helped to suppress things like this. There is the economic breakthrough, certainly, as well, which this would be very disruptive. A breakthrough in the physics here would render, not overnight, but very rapidly, all that investment in carbon fossil fuels, that render it redundant in a very short space of time, which one would argue would be a good thing for the planet. But of course, whole economies are built on that edifice. So that's not good for economies. So that's another reason. Science, I think, is a third, in that, science, traditional mainstream science, particularly on the sort of astrophysical side, is invested in Big Bang theory. That is, the Big Bang is our dominant science theory for how the universe began, from a speck of energy that explodes outwards to form the universe and everything in it. So a lot of money is invested scientifically in that paradigm, and anything that would challenge that paradigm would be consciously or unconsciously suppressed by a scientific mainstream that it relies on billions of pounds, dollars, euros, whatever, to feed it, and whole careers to sustain it. So you do build up a picture. It's not conspiratorial. It's just very obvious that there are multiple sectoral reasons why this a new paradigm would be suppressed.
I'm the light beyond the mountains. I mean, digging into anti-gravity and covert projects must have shaken up your worldview of how the world really works in certain ways. Any big philosophical questions that emerged on this journey for you? And I guess I'm fascinated that you're working to reconcile sort of nuts and bolts science with consciousness and then also the paranormal. I mean, to most tuning into this anti-gravity tech and say afterlife research, they sound unrelated. One is advanced physics and the other is spiritual inquiry. Why do you see this as connected? Yeah.
Well, I sort of, in a way I don't, but in a way I do. So I did the Hunt for Zero Point journey. As I say, that finished in 2000. The book came out 2001. And I, to be honest, I wanted to leave that alone. I thought I'd be going on to something. I thought I'd be going back to my day job at, Jane's Defense Weekly. And I did for a bit. And I'd go back to writing books, which is what I also do and did. In my mind, when I finished the Hunt for Zero Point, I left it and moved on. But it didn't quite leave me alone. So I went off and did lots of different other things for a while. I guess what it had opened up for me was a sense of wonder about the world that I probably didn't have before. And as I say, I was very steeped in this, materialist paradigm. I was focused on the nuts and bolts technology of the world that I investigated. But I think it must have moved something in me because nothing after that felt satisfying. And I'd been on this, to describe the journey that I'd been on in the Hunt for Zero Point as spiritual would be overstating it. And I can sort of hear people gagging into their, they're gagging on these words because they just sound a little bit pretentious. But I nothing did feel the same afterwards. And my eyes were opened to a world of mystery and wonder that I wanted to explore or continue exploring, but I didn't have the tool set to do it with. And so I did, as I said, I went off and I did a whole load of other things, nothing to do with the Hunt for Zero Point at all. And then in 2014, I write about this in The Light Beyond the Mountains. I was in the room when my mother-in-law lay dying. And my wife, Ali, was holding her mum's hand. Her mum had been ill for a long time. But this was obviously the sort of the final moments of her life. I was standing at the end of the bed. There were many more people, her loved ones, relatives in the room. And at the precise moment my much-loved mother-in-law dies, Ali, my wife, stands up and goes, "She's all right. She's fine. Everything's good. It's all okay." And I'm looking at my wife of 20-some years, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? Because actually, it's not okay. Your mum, whom you loved very much, has just this second died. Things are very, very, very far from okay, and yet you're standing up and you're telling me this. And like me, you're not steeped in religiosity, you're spiritual, but this isn't an evangelical moment to stand up and say that everything is okay. So when I asked her later, I said, what was that about? And she said, well, weren't you there too? And I went, where? And she said, well, I was in this place that was infinite and timeless, and I knew everything, sort of time stretched and it shrank, but everything was connected. And it was imbued by this thing that I can only describe as love. And I'm going, okay, well, this must be, I'd heard of near-death experiences, but I thought, but your mum died, you're, thank God you're fine. So what's going on here? So I do a bit of investigation, and of course then I find something called a shared death experience, which I had never come across before. But I realize when I Google it and then I read about it, there are whole books on the subject, that this is a thing. So bear in mind now, this is, just over a decade ago. I'm still in this sort of materialist worldview paradigm thing. But I'm thinking, well, this is really interesting, because actually, this is the left brain side of me kicks in, because this is data. It's not my wife uniquely having a mystical experience. There are hundreds of thousands of people who've had this experience, and they're all describing something remarkably similar. Oh, and we've got crossover data with near-death experiences and with psychedelic experiences. And these are all talking about something remarkably similar. So at that point, I'm thinking, I've got to go and check this out. I've got to find out what this thing is. So that then leads me into this whole realm of consciousness research, which gives me the data and the background. I study this relentlessly for 5 years or so. And at the end of that, I'm thinking, what do I do with this data? I've gone from being an investigative defense reporter to now having a vast body of knowledge about consciousness and reality. Well, what do I do with it? That was nice, but I've got to put, bread on the table. So maybe I should go and write a few books or something. Then this extraordinary thing happens, which is I'm literally pondering this question. What do I do with this data? When this guy, this billionaire in Las Vegas, Robert Bigelow, decides to hold a $1.5 million essay competition about the survival of consciousness after death. And I'm thinking, I could answer that question. Now, with all the stuff that I've done, I could answer that question. And as I said earlier, I had a go. I win a prize. I go to Las Vegas. He then invites me to sit on a research panel of directors in his New Consciousness Institute. So I do that with people like Jeffrey Kripal. So suddenly and I should say in a really kind of woo-woo way, that while I was investigating all of this consciousness and reality stuff, I feel like I'm on a kind of new quest. I'm on a new hunt, and it feels really good because I'm now exploring the wonders and mysteries of the universe and reality and consciousness and mind, which I'm very interested in. And so, but still struggling with that idea of, I can't turn this into anything professional because it's not my background. But so my little mantra each day would be, I want to work with the world's leading researchers of consciousness. And that's my little mantra as I'm doing it. And then after I win the essay prize in the essay contest, I'm invited to Las Vegas to sit, as I said, on this research panel of directors. And I'm looking around the table and there are the world's leading researchers of consciousness around me. And I think, shit, this stuff really works. It really works. So anyway, that's how I got there.
Hey there, inspired souls. Nick's just mentioned shared death experiences, and Dr. Raymond Moody is the forefather. He coined the term near-death experiences and also the term shared death experiences, and he's been on the Inspired Evolution podcast. We have done a few near-death experience episodes, but this particular episode with Dr. Raymond Moody was like an incredible deep dive into near-death experiences, shared death experiences. If you're more fascinated about some of this stuff, please check out that episode with Dr. Raymond Moody. I'll put a link just up here for you to go check it out. Just wanted to offer that into the space in case you're inspired in such ways. Also, Nick has mentioned potential quite a few times in this episode, and helping you live your highest calling and unlocking your deepest potential, ultimately living your dharma and thriving on purpose is my life's mission through this podcast and my coaching, mentoring, and masterminding. So if you want to find out more about Evolve Mastermind, amritsandhu.com/call. You can book in a call with myself. There's a link in the show notes below as well. And also, importantly, we're discussing quite a few of Nick's different mystical experiences here, and many of you have shared your mystical experiences in the community as well. So if you don't know, there's in the Inspired Evolution community, there's a space where people are sharing these really profound experiences, which, like Nick's saying it, people don't really pick them up from each other because we're not really able to share with them. But actually, in the Inspired Evolution community and space, there's a really safe space where people are sharing some really profound experiences that they've had that they've not been able to share anywhere else. And actually, people are having like-minded, like-hearted experience as well. So if you want to find out more, just remember, this community is here for you. inspiredevolution.com/circle. Link in the description below as well. See you on the inside. It's incredibly fascinating. I did want to just jump in there for a sec, because rogue icons, I mean, yeah, at face value, you helped us peer behind the curtain in terms of what it really meant for you. Can you help us peer behind the curtain in terms of what the light behind the mountains means to you?
Yeah. So I root it in a context that is familiar to me, in the sense that, so I'd already done this, as I said, this consciousness sort of research. And of course, by the way, and, all your viewers and listeners will know this is a subject you can never end in terms of research. I mean, it's going to go on forever. But I'm thinking, even though I've got this sort of consciousness knowledge now, I've got to root it in a world that I'm familiar with. And the one thing I'd never done was I'd never investigated the UFO phenomenon. So I thought, I'm pretty sure, because I'd come from that world, that there's more to UFOs. There's much more to UFOs than anything man-made. I'm pretty sure about that, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure too that there's more to it than simply a technology angle, because I know about that stuff as well. So the missing part for me was this consciousness piece, and I became familiar with the writings of great researchers in this field, like Jacques Vallée, who quite early on in this space for me, as I was looking at consciousness and its sort of intersection with the UFO phenomenon, which is not, by the way, I don't think, intuitive. I mean, it's quite counterintuitive in a way, because people say, well, what have UFOs got to do with consciousness? And perhaps we can come back to that in a minute. But I'm sitting in this theater in New York City, watching and listening to Jacques Vallée speak about remote viewing, actually, which you may be familiar with, but I came into the remote viewing story because one of the pioneers of remote viewing, the CIA's remote viewing program, its psychic spying program, which kicked off in 1972 or 3, was a chap called Ingo Swann, who was a psychic. And I knew Ingo. I mean, I'd met Ingo. Ingo had contacted me, from my writings and the stuff that I was doing, and said, do you ever come through New York? Because I'd like to meet you and talk to you about your research. And so I spent some time with him in New York before his death in 2013. And in 2017, as I was saying, I was in this theatre lecture hall in New York City, listening to Jacques Vallée talk, because we were all there to honour Ingo at something called the 5th Philip K. Dick Film Festival. And Jacques Vallée was talking about UFOs being both physical and psychic. And even though I'd done a bit of digging until that point, this is something I'm really struggling with. You know, how can things we see in the sky, or things lots of people see in the sky, which appear to be solid, and indeed manifest as solid because they leave traces on the ground, or they leave radar traces. You know, radar needs to ping off something solid to give it a return. So these things are clearly solid at least part of the time. So, but how can they be unreal some of the time as well? And so the Light Beyond the Mountains is really, its portal of entry into consciousness is through the UFO phenomenon, and it's about which I think I'm qualified to speak because of my aerospace and defense background. So it takes the reader in initially into quite safe, reassuring ground. You know, ideal to begin with the very sort of solid aspects of the UFO phenomenon, and I deal with it as I would wearing my investigative defense reporter's hat. So I'm eliminating what it can't be before we get on to what it could be. And I hope by doing that because I'm always writing for a mainstream readership, you know, I always want to reach out to an audience or readership that is not versed in this stuff, because it's pretty bloody arcane, to be absolutely honest. I mean, and I found that even coming to it with quite a bit of background, that it's a lot of it is extremely counterintuitive. It's obviously deeply mystifying and baffling, but there's a language to it as well, which is also quite impenetrable. And so part of what I wanted to do was to open up the sort of the language of it all, to make it accessible to people who wouldn't normally be interested in this stuff, because that was very much my journey too. You know, I'm a sort of journeyman investigator, you know, just an annoyingly curious person who wants to know answers. And so that is the point of view from which The Light Beyond the Mountains is told. But obviously there are pivot points. One of them we've dealt with was when my mother-in-law died. And there are other pivot points too. But by the sort of midpoint of the book, you're now definitely on a sort of different journey. It's a journey about consciousness and what is reality and what is the meaning of existence. What is the meaning of purpose? Why are we here? All of that stuff. And it was great. It just was a fantastic experience. And, you know, I'm still sort of on that path because, as I said, you can never get to the root of this mystery. But I think you can tick off certain things. And I think I have ticked off certain aspects of this narrative in a way that will lead people to perhaps see the world differently from how, you know, I have spent the bulk of my life looking out the window and going, that tree or that thing out there is solidly real. This desk under my laptop here is solidly real. Well, that's actually a moot point, because atoms aren't solid. They're 99% empty space. But yet something renders that, the fluidity of the quantum world into a solid material thing. And that thing, whatever it is that renders it solid, is not known. And like I say, science is investigating that from the quantum mechanical perspective. That's respectable, but there's so much that it's not doing because it's heretical and taboo. And that's terrain that I'm excited to enter, because it is much of it is uncharted, it's unexplored, and that's very exciting. And it's great territory for a book as well.
It's interesting as well, because through your studying your work, it became interesting to consider that science, you mentioned the sort of button-down nature of it. Even stuff like remote viewing is not something that actually science itself sort of pursues, really. It's actually these other sort of pockets of military advancement and stuff that actually bring this sort of science to the fore, which is when you pause to reflect upon just that fact in and of itself is actually, it's quite interesting. Yeah, I find that.
It is.
Yeah.
And it actually touches on something very real that I've noticed for a while, which is where science is often afraid to go, the military is not. And militaries are obviously about advantage. They're about, I need to have a step up and over on my rivals militarily. Otherwise, I'm going to be defeated on the battlefield, in the battle space. So remote viewing is a great example of that, where science is saying non-local information, the ability to perceive information non-locally at a distance in time or space from you and your mind is impossible. That's what classical physics says. The military couldn't give a shit about that. It literally goes, well, if it works and it's demonstrated to work, we'll use it. And remote viewing was a program that kicked off in, as I said, 72 or 73. It was declassified in 1995, but it had been going for almost 20 years with funding from the CIA and various other US intelligence agencies. One of my mantras is from All the President's Men, which is follow the money. If you don't believe stuff, see what people are spending real money on. And here you have government agencies spending year on year real money on programs that the scientific community is dismissing as woo-woo junk. So there is there's a contradiction there, and that's not the only time that has happened. The military, again, which is a world that clearly that I've come from, is often doing that, and so I following the money and following data, that's what I tend to look at, and that will render you many more clues to how things really are often than what mainstream science tells you. So again, it's about keeping that 360-degree worldview that I was saying earlier, which is particularly important when you're doing an investigation, because there is so much fake data out there and fake news. You have to be very mindful of that.
It's interesting because at this point how does, you mentioned earlier, we might circle back to this, UFO consciousness phenomenon, like, can we draw back into this at this point here? Like, how are they related? Because it does seem like to you that they are related. I'm conscious that, even the exploration that, well, at some point you've expressed that the view that the universe itself is conscious, right? And that, looking at how much time you spent researching technology as well, really got me thinking in terms of what that implies about our approach to technology and innovation even. Like, is us inventing new technologies a way of expanding the universe's own self-awareness and stuff, or am I getting too deep into the rabbit hole here? I'm just curious about some of your reflections here.
Not at all. It is the nub of the mystery, of course, and so for me, it was really starting from first principles, and in some respects, even though I don't have a science or physics background, I've obviously spent a lot of time talking to scientists and physicists and engineers, but I don't have that background, and in some respects, perversely, that's helpful. It has been helpful to me, because I'm not in any particular swim lane when it comes to studying this stuff. I don't have skin in any game or part of physics or biology or chemistry or whatever. I'm looking at a smorgasbord of data, and I'm trying to pull stuff out that to me makes sense. So I studied, as I said, I studied the whole consciousness thing a lot. But in The Light Beyond the Mountains, I come to focus on three people who are really instructive to me for formulating my own worldview or opinion, at the very least, on what I feel is the basis of a construct that begins to make sense. At least to me it does. Those three people were Ingo Swann, whom we've discussed briefly. Ingo goes into the various layers of the self that make up a conscious human entity, and they start with the ego, and they go through 3 or 4 layers of us to the soul, to a sort of soul level consciousness, and then out beyond that into what he called the matrix, which is the wider reality, the consciousness of reality. Those layers, if we can call them those, are actually all blended into one another. They're, we see an avatar, a sort of shell of a human or shell of anything, and go, that is a sort of self-contained unit. But that's only the way we see the world. That's the way we see the icons on the screen. We see those icons as individuated units of consciousness. So Ingo was helpful to me. Donald Hoffman, as we've discussed, was helpful to me in how he provided a metaphor to me for how we perceive reality on this screen that is completely geared to our survival as a species or as a sort of conscious entity, in that it filters out all the swirling energetic stuff that Ingo is talking about in his universe, which is just a mass of primordial energies. But Donald Hoffman gives me that metaphor, that ability for me now to be able to see myself and everything around me in a material way. I mean, that is the framework that Einstein's space-time construct gives us. It gives us this framework of material reality. And then finally, there was the astronaut Edgar Mitchell, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, 6th man to walk on the moon. He has this epiphany on the way back from the moon in which he senses that not only is the universe alive, but that he and it are inseparable. They are not separate, that we and it are just conjoined, and everything is. So now that sense that my wife Ali had at the moment that her mum died, she had this shared death experience, begins to make sense, in that she said that everything she saw and felt was connected, and it was underpinned by knowledge and information. Well, Edgar Mitchell says that the universe is a holographic construction. It is effectively two-dimensional, but we perceive it as three-dimensional. We perceive, in fact, four-dimensional with time as well. So these three minds, these three people, gave me a window through which I could begin to make sense of this existence for myself. And what it comes down to me, and I don't want to spoil too much for those who want to go into the light beyond the mountains, because it, a bit like the Hunt for Zero Point, it hinges on some sort of cliffhangers, if I can call them those. But I veer towards simulation theory, that we live in a simulated world, but not the cold simulated world of the Sims game that my kids used to play. This is a world that is a simulated world that is imbued with something ineffable and beyond that. That is the essence, if you like, of whoever or whatever created it. And I don't know whether that's a machine or if it's God, but whatever is behind this simulation clearly put a lot of thought into it. And I think that, again, I go into this in the book, that everything about his, her, or its creation is about feedback. This is a model of the universe that wants to learn and grow, a bit like a self-learning artificial intelligence wants to learn and grow. That is what this universe is about. To me, it is a giant computational engine that feeds off the feedback of its creation to explore its own creation and learn and grow. And so that is also where the book goes as well.
Inspired soul human being, you're enjoying this video, so please do give it a thumbs up and a like, and we'd love for you to join in on the conversation. This is such a multifaceted conversation. What are you taking away from today's podcast? We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Back to Nick in today's podcast. At this juncture in the conversation, I can't help but feel a couple of things. I'm going to try and see if I can get the words out. If I was to keep it succinct, it's that education's almost a weapon. More education is a weapon, actually, in some ways in this regard, because also what it's doing is, like, when the quantum superpotentiality, when you're informing so many people the same data set, you actually collapse potential down and actually rigidify things, if that's a word that I can make up. It's really interesting just what's landing for me as you're sharing all that you've shared at this particular juncture in the conversation.
Well, I think, you asked me earlier about secrecy and UFOs and stuff. I think non-human intelligence we can handle. I think we can handle the idea that non-human intelligence exists, and not only it exists, but it's visited us here, and it may even be present here on a permanent basis. I think, by and large, we are grown up enough as a species to be able to handle that information. I think where it gets sticky is where it goes from there, which is about the nature of reality. I don't personally have a difficulty with the idea that I may be an avatar, me, Nick, and everything and everyone around me that I see may be an avatar for this source consciousness of the simulated creation. I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I find that very empowering. The idea that I may be a splinter of some huge, great, infinite consciousness that may or may not be godlike. I'm good with that personally, but I think that would challenge a lot of people, and that then is something that would be not taboo exactly, but would be something that would need to be approached very carefully, cautiously, and mindfully. I personally believe that it is our destiny, knowing this stuff, is That is the evolution. It is the paradigm shift. It is the awakening, if you want to call it that, where we get to understand that we are much more than our physical selves. This is something inculcated in me by Ingo Swann, who was always on about human potential. You know, he said that his psychic gifts that the CIA borrowed from or used to remote view and spy on the Soviet Union or wherever, those psychic gifts were not unique to him. We all have them. It's just that we don't see ourselves as having them because that's the way we've been conditioned to see. But I think the more strangeness that we see in the world, and I think we are confronted, particularly now, you know, I mean, the world feels pretty squirrely and strange and uncertain and anxious, you know, to a large degree. I think that the knowledge that we are more than our physical selves is something consoling, hopeful, and exciting, actually, that, you know, it's something that deserves exploration. And so I'm happy with that, but I can see why it would be difficult terrain for many people to enter.
The Light Beyond the Mountains is subtitled A Journey into Consciousness, Anomalous Phenomena, and Next Generation Humanity. From everything you've seen and studied, what, I guess, do you envision for the next generation of humans if we were to integrate these discoveries? Many of the things we've discussed today, anti-gravity, consciousness research, etc. How could this, in your mind, transform the way we live, transform the way we relate to each other? And I guess ultimately what excites you the most about the future that, you know, obviously it's called inspired evolution. What excites you about the future that we could create with this expanded understanding of reality?
Well, the light in the title is deliberate because by nature I'm hopeful, but I do think, you know, we are at an inflection point where there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of danger in the world, and there's, as I said, there's a lot of anxiety about the world at the moment. We don't have to look very far to see that and understand that. You know, I never thought when I was writing about the end of the Cold War in, you know, 1991, 92, that we would be experiencing a new Cold War as we are now that is actually in great danger of turning hot. And of course, I didn't imagine either that things like artificial intelligence would be where they are currently, which, you know, arguably is on the threshold of a singularity that will, we don't know where that's going to go. And that's the point. But it doesn't stop tech billionaires in Silicon Valley from pushing the boundary out and going, what the hell? We're gonna develop and field this stuff, whether we know what it's going to do to the rest of us or not. So for me, you know, we live in a sort of 20th century paradigm construct in all ways, which is broken. You know, if you look at the planet, if you look at climate, if you look at human relations, if you look at geopolitical relations, it's not working. You know, it really isn't. So we have to look to something new and transformational that is going to get us to a place where we continue to survive as a species, and not only that, we flourish as one. And so for all the fear that exists around the world right now, I am hopeful that, because consciousness seems to have this strange quality about it, which is the more humanity seeks to suppress stuff, consciousness, you know, it's like a sort of a balloon that you sort of compress. It's going to squeeze out between your fingers elsewhere. and find, relief from that pressure. And consciousness, I think, is a little like that. We see regimes, suppressing people and humanity, and that is not a good thing. But by the same token, we see this awakening happening in terms of interests in mind and spirit and mysticism and esotericism. And it's almost as if, the more one is compressed, the other is enlightened and alleviated. And so that gives me some hope that for all of the anxieties around this time, that there is a transitional point coming, and in which things open up, and we are given a new paradigm of physics, and we are given a new paradigm of human relations, and we are given possibly insights into understanding that we may not be the apex species in the universe that until now we think ourselves to be. And we're going to have to learn to be neighbors to intelligences that we didn't think existed. But I think the evidence says that they do. And I think the evidence also says that they're here. And we need to acclimatize to that. But I think in that new paradigm, in that new era, that's where we're headed. And it can only be better than the mismatches that I think we're confronted with in the current paradigm.
Nick, I'll put links to both books and your Substack in the comments below. What a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you.
Thanks for asking me some pretty on-point questions, which really got me to think, but I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I genuinely appreciate your time and energy and sharing yourself so abundantly here with us today. But I think it's painfully obvious, not painfully, blissfully obvious, to all of us here that this is actually your life's work that this conversation really stands on the shoulders of. So yes, thank you so much for your time and energy here today, but also thank you so much for you, Nick. Really, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for doing this.
I've loved every minute of it. Thanks so much, Amrit.
Inspired soul human being, you made it through to the end of another really incredible episode. You've obviously enjoyed this episode, so please do give it a thumbs up and a like. And I want to take a moment once again to thank all of you that are subscribed to the podcast. Everything you see around here is a total co-creation. It's powered and empowered by your subscription to this podcast. Thank you so much for your incredible love and your support. And to all of you that haven't yet subscribed, and at the time of this recording, that's actually 4/5 of you that regularly watch these videos aren't actually subscribed. So many of you actually think you're subscribed, but you're not. So if you can see the subscribe button below, please hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification icon, join the community, join the movement, spreading love, positivity, and wisdom like this around the planet together. Thank you so much for your incredible support. It powers, like I said, and empowers all of this and makes it possible. Thank you so much for your co-creative energy. Really, really, really appreciate it. Talking about co-creation, friendly reminder, welcome, warm invitation to inviting you home into the Inspired Evolution Circle. You can join us on the inside, join the community. We gather once a month, asking questions from the guests directly. I step out of the way and you get to ask your questions directly of the guests. And we gather weekly for meditations, Reiki, breath work, lots of cool stuff happening on the inside of the circle. So if this content inspires you and you want to transform that into deeper and deeper levels of connection, welcome. Join us on the inside, inspiredevolution.com/circle. Would love to see you on the inside. And on screen now, to keep your inspirations flowing onwards, upwards, and inwards, we mentioned Dr. Raymond Moody on Shared Death Experiences, an episode here to go in there. He also mentioned remote viewing. So Darius J. Wright, out-of-body master and expert who leaves his body and witnesses the construct and all the different things going on in there. And another episode on screen for you to take your inspirations, keep them flowing onwards, upwards, and inwards. Take your pick, make your click. I will see you in the next one. So go on. I'll see you there.